while it's important that we don't underestimate the scale of spying by national security agencies, it's also important that we don't frighten ourselves by overestimating the abilities of the individuals engaged in these activities. A colleague and veteran activist tells me that her master's thesis was on George Eliot, and when an associate of hers obtained their ASIO file, there were transcripts from tapped phone conversations between them with comments in the margins by the ASIO agents questioning the identity of this person, George Eliot, who was under discussion. So I think, yes, we should be alert, very alert, but not necessarily quaking in our boots. And it's also important to acknowledge how incompetence plays a role in sometimes derailing a campaign or movement. And I don't know if everybody's already seen this, the Simple Sabotage Field Manual written in 1944 by CIA's precursor, the Office of Strategic Services, which details how purposeful stupidity can be used to derail organisations. And I think it's probably the fact that I read this some years ago, that's probably more than anything else responsible for me seeing spies lurking in every meeting that I attend, because so much of this behaviour is typical. So the men in ASIO have created lots of busy work spying on women. And I say men because the majority of special agents have always been male, although the numbers are beginning to equalise. However, it's difficult to be sure because it's likely that ASIO now counts as female increasing numbers of men in dresses. And the idea of men posing as women to spy on them is by no means unprecedented. The famous French transgender spy Chevalier d'Eon successfully infiltrated the court of Empress Elizabeth of Russia by presenting as a woman. That was back in the 1700s, and he was a French diplomat, soldier, and spy for Louis XV, and had androgynous physical characteristics. d'Eon actually claimed to have been born female and raised male, and later obtained permission from the king to dress and live as a woman. However, after his death, it was discovered that he had fully intact male genitals. And the term Eonism was derived from his name and refers to the adoption of traditionally female dress and behaviour by a man. And the physician who coined the term wrote a description of it, which has a lot in common with the description given by Blanchard in formulating his theory about autogynephilia. So recruitment of transgender spies seems to be in full swing. And I've personally encountered individuals in women's organisations whom I suspect on both counts. That is, I suspect them of being men and of being spies. In at least one case, I've had my suspicions somewhat confirmed some years later. And of course, not all spies and saboteurs are necessarily government recruits. They may be spies for other organisations or bodies. About 10 years ago, I had the strange experience of volunteering for over a year in a women's organisation, filling a shift with not just one, but often two fellow volunteers who were concealing their trans identity, making me unwittingly the only woman in the room. I had my suspicions about one of them, but dismissed them at the time as too far-fetched because that was before my awareness of the trans activism. This was my first encounter with it. More noteworthy to me at the time was that one of these individuals appeared to be actively undermining the continued viability of the organisation by filing debt notices from the tax office in the bin. And they also appeared to be organising the volunteer roster suboptimally to ensure regular closure of the service. So perhaps this was some of the purposeful stupidity I read about earlier. This individual subsequently encouraged a younger woman who identified as a non-binary pansexual to campaign aggressively for the service to make constitutional changes to explicitly accommodate all individuals claiming to be women. I found myself fighting many battles while not really comprehending the hidden agenda. For example, their desire to promote a commercial hair removal service struck me as entirely inconsistent with feminist principles, but of course I was failing to apprehend the importance of this service for increasing members of our clientele. At one stage, I found minutes from one of their meetings left lying around, and so gradually the nature of their intentions became more apparent to me. However, even considering the possibility of some wolves in sheep's clothing, I think we have to recognise the unhappy possibility that some of those spying on us within our groups are likely to be women that we all know and trust. And here are some pictures of women who have worked as Australian spies in the past, just to demonstrate that they don't all look like James Bond or drag queens. One particularly successful spy during the Cold War was the housewife Anne Neal, who's depicted here emerging from the People's Bookshop. Her activities on behalf of ASIO are described in the book Spies and Sparrows by Philip Deary. She was very successful gaining trust and infiltrating the Communist Party of Australia because of her natural veneer as a fluttery old lady. So Anne Summer writes in her essay about her ASIO file, now that ASIO's files from those days are available, we can retrospectively say that our paranoia was justified. It is clear we considerably underestimated just how extensively we were being monitored. But in fact, it wasn't paranoia at all, because paranoia is the irrational and persistent feeling that people are out to get you, or that you are the subject of persistent intrusive attention by others. But it's not paranoia if the feeling is rational and reality-based. There is also another lesser-known term taught to me by a friend who suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, and that term is pronoya. And pronoya is a word coined to describe a state of mind that is the opposite of paranoia. Whereas a person suffering from paranoia feels that persons or entities are conspiring against them, a person experiencing pronoia feels that the world around them conspires to do them good, even when there is evidence to the contrary. Pronoia, which is irrational and not reality-based, seems to be a widespread and undiagnosed problem among many women. And I would suggest that it's possibly a symptom of the Stockholm Syndrome. And as you'd be aware, Stockholm Syndrome is a coping mechanism for those in captive or abusive situations, where people develop positive feelings towards their captors or abusers over a period of time. It's quite apparent to me from my work in the domestic violence rosters in the Sydney local courts that Stockholm Syndrome is a widespread affliction among women, and most of us need to examine ourselves for these symptoms. Indeed, I'd suggest it exists on a societal-wide basis, and these affectionate feelings by women towards men are an essential element in enabling the patriarchy to flourish. So, as I was saying, it's not paranoia if your feelings are rational and reality-based, no matter how outlandish it might sound. For example, I have an intrusive thought that men in high places dressed up as women are scheming against us and undermining the gains made by feminism, by insisting that men should have access to women's spaces, services and sports, and indeed by seeking to change the very definition of woman, while also indoctrinating our children and subjecting the most vulnerable to hormones and surgeries that will sterilize and maim them for life. That does sound pretty far-fetched, but as we can see from some of the characters on the screen, there are people who really seem to be working at this.